have I got a podcast that I want you to listen to? I recently met Dr. Robert Winter as a potential customer, and we immediately hit it off in relation to his experiences and his work as a PhD in leadership. It's rare that you get to meet a mind that spent so much time thinking about how this all hangs together and how that you make progress in a leadership position. And I loved this hour and a half I spent with Rob. It feels like a work unfinished, though. And it also feels like a first date in that we were trying to get to know each other a little bit. And we didn't quite get to some of the meat of the real issues that we wanted to get to. And maybe that will come next time. I don't know. But if you have an hour or an hour and a half, it's worth a listen. And if you want to understand some philosophies around what you could do with your team, then Dr. Winter's the guy. What it also has me reflecting on is this: our brightest people in this country or any country often struggle to find their place because they've spent their time honing their mind on some exceptional concepts. And how you make that real for the workplace or society or whatever it might be takes the skill of storytellers. Now, it might be that you're not the PhD, but you might be the storyteller. And so take a look, take a listen, and think about what your role might be in giving some of these beautiful people the voice that they deserve when it comes to shaping the way that business and society is run. I love this one. Check it out.
Robert Winter, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Chris, and thank you very much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to this one, actually. I feel like we've met and we've hit it off on so many themes already. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of getting sort of all gushy and emotional, it feels like that sort of life partner that you meet and on the first date you just think we've known each other for years, and then you realize actually you haven't. You've spent lifetimes apart, but now you've kind of found that moment and found that connection.
Well, it's good because it's going to be really weird because at the end of this I am going to propose to you. So let's see how it goes.
Brilliant. My wife's listening. She'll be very excited.
Looking forward to it. As always, I start these things off with what's on your mind and what do you care about. And is atypical of your style. You did some prep work for me, which I appreciate. So I'm just going to read these off, and then we're just going to start with what's logical for you.
Yeah.
The themes are: why is traditional management often inadequate in complex environments? Number one. Number two, how can leaders distinguish between complexity and mere complication? Number three, what principles should guide leadership in the face of complexity? 4, how can organizations support adaptive change without losing coherence? 5, what are the traps leaders fall into when dealing with complexity? And 6, what's one mindset shift leaders must embrace to succeed in complex environments? I mean, they all appeal to me.
I'm glad. It'd be really awkward if we sat here and you went, these questions are not what I want on my show, and then fumble through the next hour.
That's right. That's right. Where's a logical starting point for you? Like, what's the thing that's the burning issue for you at the moment, and those themes or something else that's on your mind?
Look, I mean, I think those themes come a little bit from my academic background. My background is having to constantly defend ideas and defend theses, usually in front of groups of very, shall we say, hostile academics. It's their nature to pick things apart. So I think I suppose we talk a lot these days about imposter syndrome or fears that we have in the workplace. My biggest fear is being unprepared. And I think to an extent it leads me into being over-prepared, overthinking, and then that starts to interfere with interpersonal relationships in the workplace. And so what I think it brings me back to is good people wanting to do well. I've worked for some really wonderful and, shall we say, highly problematic organizations in my life. And a consistent theme among all of them is there are really good people doing really good work, but these people so often speak about the organizations they're in as being a little bit toxic. And it's, well, why do you work here? Because I love the people. They don't love the organization. Sometimes they don't even love the management, the executive, or the board, but they love the people they work with. And that increasingly got me thinking about, well, these good people so often don't have a formal leadership role. So in an organization, they don't get called leader. The CEO gets that delight. They get to go to conferences, appear on podcasts, write books. But the people in the organization that are often doing, at least in my view, a much better job of demonstrating leadership are the informal leaders. Technically, it's called discretionary boundary spanning. In other words, Chris, you run a team. I've got an issue that I'm working on at work. I found a solution to it, and now I've got to try and convince you to work with me. Unlike, say, an executive who can issue a management directive and get on with it or get out of the organization. So that discretionary boundary spanning or that formal leadership is really, for me, the heart or the nexus of the good people coming together to really drive organizational success.
I really love that. I'm going to actually loop back to the first thing you said and explore that a little bit. But discretionary boundary spanning, which is, I know I'm paraphrasing, an informal leadership capability as opposed to a directive leadership capability, and I'm working backwards intentionally. I also agree with you about, not that's about this, about good organizations having good people, but sometimes environments being toxic. That's a real conundrum. The bit that you said first, biggest fear is being unprepared, but but it interferes with personal relationships.
Yeah,
like what's that about? How so?
I think that comes in, and this sort of almost brings us to, I guess, one of the tips, which we might come to a little bit later on in the show, is this notion of a shared language. In organizations, particularly as they become more diverse, the bulk of my colleagues speak multiple languages. And so although we primarily communicate in English, their idioms, their understanding of the language, what words mean, often differ from a lot of their other colleagues. And sometimes you get interpersonal friction because of how people understand words. But also, even if there isn't a friction, sometimes you don't get the desired outcomes because people aren't working towards that common goal, which is what one of the key purposes of language is, to give us that common goal, to take that visualization or that idea that I have in my head, to share it with you through the medium of words. And then we go, brilliant, we're baking a cake today, and it's going to be a chocolate cake. If you've got a different concept of chocolate to what I have, then the cake recipe is not going to come together very well. And that sort of unpacks in organizations where there often isn't a shared language, or if there is, it's a little bit of an artificially imposed language that sometimes doesn't work outside the organization.
How, again, acknowledging the multiple languages and the interpretation and the communication piece. It's just interesting for me about preparedness interfering with personal relationships. I'll give you an example. I'm an over-preparer, and I really, but it's probably my insecurity around, not that I actually feel particularly vulnerable from looking stupid. That's not that. And also, I'm not that afraid because I'll do things anyway. But I do notice that sometimes my subconscious can get control of my conscious words and stop me from doing something that I know is good for me and good for the business, good for the team. And so, therefore I prepare. And I can't explain it. I still, today, can't explain why I am that way. And I, I'm nearly 50 and I am really expert in this. And yet still sometimes I hold back. And that interferes with my personal relationships. That interferes with my business success.
Yeah.
Which is why it's just an interesting coincidence that you've led off with that, because it's something that I'm mulling over right now as I face speaking at conferences and people ask me you've got a view, and I'm like, a hell no. Insert an excuse. And it's not even like I haven't done it before.
No.
It's just I'm a hell no right now, and I can't work it out. So I just found it interesting. We talk about biggest fears being unprepared and interferes with personal relationships.
I mean, I'll probably, if I may, pick up perhaps on some of the language you used, again, talking about shared languages and using the concept of feeling stupid. And I always say that there's a difference between what I think you could term the Socratic acceptance of the limits of our knowledge. In other words, we're all in a state of ignorance, no matter how educated we are. And then there's genuine stupidity, which is a person who, a la the Dunning-Kruger effect, doesn't know what they don't know. They're at the top of Mount Stupid. And ironically, it's stupid people who just crash straight in. It doesn't occur to them that this new initiative for the organization might be riddled with problems because they don't understand what the problems are. And yet the very people you want leading those type of challenges, the very people you want speaking at conferences, are people who are they're not stupid because they're aware of their ignorance, but that self-awareness is what creates some of the fear, because you start to realize, and I feel this whenever I talk about philosophy, it's such a fundamentally deep field with the most brilliant minds in history thinking about it. And I look at this almost mountain of genius and just think, gosh, I don't even know where to start on the foothills, let alone get high enough up to the peak to actually have something to offer. But in a sense, that is the offering, our understanding of our own ignorance, which we then share with our colleagues. And so long as we've got a psychologically safe environment, that really is, for me, where the magic happens, because we start to, instead of finding problems often much later on when we can't fix it, we start to anticipate them. We start to think in for example, a tech project space, what's it going to be like on day one of the release? Who's manning the phones? Who's attending to support tickets? What happens if the server goes down? All of these elements tend not to occur to the stupid people, but they do occur to the people who are aware of their ignorance and therefore want to be over-prepared to make sure they've got the solutions for if and when it goes wrong.
Just that quote: we're all in a perpetual state of ignorance, despite our education. Was it?
Despite our education, despite our learning, despite how much we experience and read and come to know about the world, because we can't know everything. And as the world becomes ever more complex, we're finding that each year we're, in a sense, generating more information and more research. And the specialization is wondrous. It's what creates the microphones we're talking through right now, or the phones that you're perhaps listening to this on. But that specialization also makes it, looping back to management and leadership, harder and harder to lead and manage in those circumstances. Go back to the Middle Ages, an erudite person could read pretty much all of the books in the world in their lifetime. Now, the Library of Congress add, 2 million books or something to their collection every year? Listeners, please go and fact check that. But it's a vast number of books that they add. And so the reality is you can't get through it. So we're all looking at snapshots. But yet, particularly as we rise and become leaders of organizations, there's this ever-growing field for which we now have responsibility. And this, I think, comes back to not just surrounding yourself with good people, but understanding how to unlock the questions to ask those good people.
It's, you're raising a couple of conundrums that I face, or I think of often. I found over the years in leadership that I feel like I'm going to say it's like I'm paraphrasing a quote, that there are no stupid people, but the path of questioning, the chance to pose questions and have them answered in a psychologically safe way. I'll use what you've said, which has been a theme of several conversations already this morning for me.
Wonderful.
Those environments are rare. Yeah. They're hard to come by.
Exceedingly.
Right? And so, the opposite ends of the spectrum, if people have never been taught to ask a question, they therefore stay where they are. Yeah. And at the same time, there are those that are exceptional, erudite, asking questions. They have this vast well of knowledge and ability to draw on. And I notice they're not utilized either. In fact, we're all just seemingly homogenized into average.
Yeah, absolutely.
And neither end of the spectrum gets what they need to help the organization perform, which again comes back to psychological safety, the environment, and the role of leadership. Because I have a view on my role as a leader, I hope, and more than a manager, and I know you have that distinction. Yeah. And that is to make it safe. That is to create a place of psychological safety, despite what's going on in their life and everything else, to create opportunities for freedom, financial and work, and to give them the employability they need for whatever they do next. And it isn't always about staying with me in whatever business I'm running. Yeah, that I think is an obligation of leadership. In fact, I feel like a glue between those ends of the spectrum: the exceptionally educated and well-read and thoughtful, and those that have not had yet the chance or the opportunity to ask those questions because they're there. So I think the question I ask is then perhaps for leaders, and maybe it's for me, but what advice do you give to people in that sort of circumstance as you mull that problem over? Like, what's it raising for you?
I think the first thing, and you sort of, I think quite effectively spoke about wanting to go beyond management to lead. And that's where, in a sense, leadership starts. Leadership, in a sense, begins where the basics of management stop. So we sort of spoke about a little earlier some of the areas in terms of complication and complexity. And I always like to think that management is very good at complication. So if you were to take something like a tech team and you were running, say, a Scrum environment, and you've got your sprint ceremonies and you've got quality assurance engineers and coders and business analysts, there's a lot of complexity involved in that. And therefore project managers, and it's why it's very appropriate manager is in their title, even though they often don't have direct reports, is that it's a process to be managed. It's complex and it requires coordination. It's complicated and it requires coordination. But complex environments are ones that tend to become more amorphous. There's less certainty. People don't react in the way that you expect them to. I think anyone who's a manager of an organization and who's launched out with a new initiative and they've said something like, as an organization, we're going to start delivering services rural and remote. And they think, this is wondrous, I'm painting a picture. And the team go, okay, this has now gone beyond complication. It's now gone into complexity. We don't understand what that looks like. You haven't articulated your vision to us well enough. And we now have uncertainty. We've also got uncertainty because this is a brand new goal or objective for the company. We haven't heard about this before. So you're taking away the assurance or the certainty that we have about the role that we're playing. And so this is where leadership then comes in to understand where some people's fears come from. We're wanting to launch out into a new space, but does that mean I might lose my job? And a lot of managers who've got the vision go, well, sorry, I didn't get where that's coming from. Because if we're now launching into a new area, maybe my role will be made redundant. And then I'll get some line like, oh, well, it's in the best interests of the business. And you can't help but think, well, that's great, but I need a little bit of interest here too. And so you start to the glue, as you mentioned, starts to weaken between employee and organization. And so I think when managers can then step into that leadership space and start thinking about the fears that their team have, turn your one-on-one into more than just a list of tasks that are done. Let's monitor the KPIs. How many calls did you answer this week? How many tickets did you close? Shifting beyond that to start to ask them even simple questions such as, how did you feel about the tickets that you worked on? Were you frustrated by some of them? Are you seeing a lot of bugs coming back? Are you finding complexity in the work because it's no longer a known workflow? There's now uncertainty being brought into the process. And in a sense, that then comes back to the erudition and the questioning. What questions should I ask people who I'm working with? And I always like to say, even if you're managing, working with, because I like to take a custodian or a stewardship approach to management. If you're an owner, potentially a little bit different in terms of organization, but for most of us, we generally will work for an organization that we will never own, even if we might take some shares out at some point. And in that sense, we are only ever the temporary custodians or stewards of the team. So again, coming back to language, I really don't like to talk about people as my team rather than as my colleagues, the people I'm working with on a project. And in doing so, it's not so much that I'm trying to think of them as friends or family, because I think, again, when organizations start talking about we're all a family, I always come back to, okay, yeah, well, you just let your sister go and she's pretty upset about it and now she's got a lawsuit against the company. That does happen in families, but generally, would you treat your sister like that? And if the answer is no, then don't call that employee family.
I really hate it when people describe it as a family.
Yeah,
it's
massive frustration.
It's a faux pas, huge.
It is.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
with a laugh.
No, it's good. I will often nest.
No,
certainly keep bringing me back.
Not at all. Again, so many. I should have booked the studio for 4 days. When a leader doesn't know, they know kind of that they've got to go from A to M. Because A to B sounds too easy. And they're not quite sure what lies in between, but they know they have to. It's very difficult to, you can express a vision for we're going to M and whatever that is. And there's all great advice around purpose and reason and both, and some themes you touched on reminded me about, with your own staff, empathy and compassion. A to M can be that way. But the details of what B, C, D, E, etc. look like, and people want to know in advance a certain type of people that you need to help you get there. It doesn't exist until you get there.
No.
And then you can only explain it when you're looking backwards. It's very hard to explain it looking forwards.
And that's where, when we talk about leaders and in commercial terms, getting the big bucks, that's where they earn it. Because what it is that setting a big, hairy goal is really easy. I was working with an organization recently, and their goal was, we want to be financially sustainable by insert name of date. And then the leaders just walk out of the room. I'm thinking, well, that's not leadership. You've given a really big goal, but there are so many different ways you can achieve financial stability. You can achieve it by reducing the size of your workforce, by cutting production costs, but you can also do it by selling more of what you do at a much higher quality because it's attracting a better customer base. So in that context, what leadership then becomes about is refining the complexity so it starts to become complication. And in that sense, as you say, going from A to M, what we're trying to do is to take that complex environment and start to provide the stage gates to it. So A to M is actually a good example because being alphabetical, we know that sort of B should sort of follow and C should follow that, and we start to go down. And that's in a sense what leaders do. We're moving office and everyone just thinks, oh, great, let's start putting stuff in boxes. But then that's where you bring the team in and say, okay, well, what are the sort of processes that we could start to bring in? How do we turn it into something linear? And that's when we, in a sense, toggle between leadership and management. Our leadership is trying to refine the questions, trying to refine the problems, trying to get the team asking the right questions. Because coming back to one of our sort of earlier comments about the sort of the difficulties that you're getting in organizational life as complication increases, we want to start to unpack the team members that have expertise in that area and get them thinking about this complex, this amorphous, this problem they don't quite understand, but in a relatively linear way that helps them to deliver. Because people will often struggle with complexity because it can be a little bit frightening, and that's when you get analysis paralysis. Either people don't analyze enough and leap in, or they start over-analyzing, you can't get them to move anywhere. And leadership is, in a sense, keeping that balance, keeping them fluid enough so we don't lose momentum, but also ensuring that we do pause at appropriate intervals to ask the right questions so we don't have a lot of rework.
So if I just try and replay that simply, so the role is of leadership to set the direction, but be fluid. But essential as part of that leadership, you have to manage, which is about breaking down the component parts, I think is what I've heard you say, and something as simple as moving office, depending on how big your organization is. And it's particularly relevant because I'm just thinking about how small we are and yet how complicated it is for me to do exactly that process. I'm like, who the hell is going to do all this stuff for me? And so you break it down into manageable components and examine along the way, so you're making sure you're not doing a lot of rework in those components. I think I've heard you say.
Because that in a sense, looking at organizational efficiency, which becomes so critical. Many years ago, particularly pre-COVID, video calls were often quite complex. And in fact, very complicated and technically fraught with difficulty, because you'd go into the room and then the video wouldn't turn on, and then you'd be on the service desk. And I remember years ago when I was on service desk, when there was a video call between Sydney and New York, I was booked for half an hour before the session to effectively start the call and ensure that all the technology worked and then troubleshoot it before the call. Now, during COVID with Teams and Zoom, they've so refined the system that no one thinks about joining a video call. The mic, the video, the connections, the bandwidth, it's kind of there and it just works. And so it is in a sense about trying to bring in some action as well to help to refine the situation. I mean, back to the moving office metaphor, sometimes you do need to just start doing things because we don't have enough information to be able to start to put together a process.
I really, that really resonates with me. I mean, it's always an adventure to get to this moment that you've just delivered there. You have to sort of, know the way to an example. This is where we're going, and show the way. And there's the vision, but there's also the doing part. I mean, I really resonate with people with a high action bias as opposed to talk.
Yeah.
Like today you've shown up. Here we are. You know, it's
Sitting in front of a mic.
set up in a week. Let's get going. You know,
Yeah.
like I notice a lot of talkers, and you know, the more higher people climb up the ranks, the less they do, and the more they talk.
Yeah.
And I think they've forgotten. Not always, because there are brilliant leaders that I deal with. To be honest, like I mean, exceptional. Some people think their job is to talk and direct, and not to know the way, show the way, go the way.
Yeah.
Which was something I picked up recently. But you know, it does link back to something that you've said earlier, and that's about the situational application of title and philosophy to the role.
Yeah.
Because you talked about custodian and stewardship, and sometimes I feel, I mean, that's a wonderful overarching philosophy, but it could also be misplaced.
Very much.
Right? Because sometimes people just need to be told to do this thing.
Absolutely.
And the more you steward, the more you custodian, the more they want to just go and do whatever they're going to do anyway. So how do you, what are your frameworks for reconciling situational leadership and the roles you might play? And I'm talking about framework in general, but then specifically the language that you use when dealing with someone to navigate that. Like, where does that take you?
I think the first step is to avoid technical language is localization, in the sense of, particularly as organizations become much bigger. I mean, you look at groups like Amazon, what is it, something like about 1 million employees worldwide. Just it's frankly impossible to actually connect with everybody. So what organizations do, and it's why they're called organizations, is we, in a sense, break them down into much smaller teams. And it's why the role of the manager and smaller team sizes and more managers has increasingly grown. I can't quite remember what the statistics are, but it's like about 20-25% of the workforce in Australia are managers. They have teams of maybe just 1 or 2 people. And that, therefore, represents a path for an organization to both surmount complexity and to deliver very complicated projects. But what it also does is it means that managers have to think differently about their team, because your team generally is small enough you start to have that more personal relationship, to discuss psychological safety. But there also comes a certain point at which we can't keep talking about it, and sometimes we just need to do things even if we have reservations about them. The old, well, let's agree to disagree, and I'll simply get this task done. And so that's where the localization of the objective comes in. So taking the very large organizational goal, coming back to one I mentioned earlier, as an organization we need to be sustainable. The role of the manager, and by extension leader, at the more junior team level is, well, what does sustainability look like for the 3 or 4 people that are around me doing what we're doing in our space? And this is where Peter Drucker's construct of management by objective and self-control comes in, which is, in a sense, you have these autonomous work groups. Work group as opposed to a team. Teams tend to be, or should I say, are fixed groups sitting under a single manager. Work groups are where you start to assemble employees across a range of different teams. So you see this particularly in something like, say, Scrum, where you might have a business analyst and a project manager. They might report to a program manager, but then you'll have a developer who'll report probably to a tech lead or to a development manager. And then there'll be varying people. So you might have 3-4 managers involved, and this starts to assemble that work group. And this is where we need to get people cooperating across these boundaries or these team lines. So, Chris, you're in this group that we're working on. I can't give you a management directive. I can reach out to your boss about it. But if you understand this localized objective, then chances are you're going to work towards it quite well, because most employees tend to be fairly good actors. You'll get some social loafers, but even the social loafers are usually, they've got to do something in their day. And so they'll start to move towards this objective if it makes sense. And this is where having a more authoritative versus authoritarian approach to management comes in. As a manager, can you articulate this localized goal, and can you articulate it in such a way that it makes sense? But as a manager and as a leader, you also have to make a decision at some point to, when does my attempt to articulate the goal need to stop? Because, as you say, we can't talk forever. And sometimes, because our small portion of this overall goal is a little bit uncertain, we can't quite grasp how it connects in. We should still start working on it anyway, because sometimes we just need a little bit of action, and then things start to unpack. And so walking that line between, look, Chris, you've just got to get this done, versus, look, Chris, let's talk about it. Let's help you to understand your role in this venture. That is effectively where the art of management and leadership comes in, knowing when to talk, when to deliberate, and when to direct, and if necessary, dictate.
And there's a lot to unpack there as well. I find it quite staggering. I think you said this, that 25% of the workforce are in management in Australia.
Again, listeners, please look up the stat, but it's very large, a very large percentage of organisations. So an org I was recently working in was around about 300 employees. Something like about 70 to 80 of them were managers. In other words, they had one or more direct reports.
Is that because no one's happy anymore just doing the work as opposed to, wanting to be seen to be climbing the ladder?
I mean, I certainly think that there's a small portion of that. I think that, and this is one of the, I guess, my bugbears about the modern leadership phenomenon, stopping calling managers and instead talking about our leaders. And whenever you see a book on leadership or, frankly, people appearing on podcasts, generally they're always CEOs or something similar. And so I think that there's this belief that, well, what does the CEO do? Now, a lot of CEOs, particularly very gifted CEOs, actually do a lot of very hard work because thinking is probably some of the hardest work as a species that humans do. Not physically necessarily taxing, but it's just very hard sitting down and wrestling with a problem. But I think that because of that, it looks like they don't do anything. Because when you see a person thinking, it's hard to work out, are they just daydreaming? Is their mind sort of in the proverbial neutral and they're actually not thinking about anything at all? Or are they wrestling with a difficult problem? I can't tell. And because in a sense they can't tell, there then starts to become this sense of, well, let's then judge them by what I do see them doing, that I can measure their quote-unquote productivity by, how many meetings they're in, how many conferences they attend, how big's their contact list, who picks up the phone when they call. And so these start to become the non-deliberative or the non-thoughtful aspects of leadership. And so more junior people start to go, oh, well, look, I see the boss. Boss is constantly out at coffees and comes back with all these great ideas. So my goal, if I want to be the boss, is to be the person at coffees coming back with great ideas. I then give it to the team and they then do the implementation. And so we have in Australia and I think the US increasingly shifted from the doers are, and I really loathe the term, the junior people in the organization, and the thinkers are the senior people in the organization, the people who aren't doing. And this actually differs quite a bit if you look at, say, more of the Scandinavian countries, or if you go to somewhere like Germany, where usually a manager will be a technical expert who is then simply given management responsibility for a team. In a country like Australia, I think that does happen at more junior management levels, but usually once you start to talk about more senior management levels, some usually slightly pretentious person will wander across and go, look, let me sit you down and talk to you about what senior leadership is. And then the tone of voice it becomes very generalized. You don't really need to know about most technical things start to become 10% of your job. And it's true if you are a general manager, given how complicated the world is, no, you can't have technical expertise in all of the ranges you discuss, but you should be able to read a balance sheet. If you're talking to a CIO or a CTO, you should have some knowledge of technology, what's coming down the pipeline. The ability in a sense, and I guess it's one of the great learnings of an MBA program, yes, you become a generalist, but you have enough information to be able to apply the sniff test. Does this feel right? And if it does, you can then actually have slightly deeper conversations with people because you can ask the right questions, versus leaders who don't have that, don't ask the right questions and instead start to believe in logos. I've hired someone who's ex-Facebook. They were in marketing. They'll be amazing. Why? Well, they were from Facebook. I mean, Facebook only hires top people. Well, some of the people at Facebook are top people, but it's a large organization. There's bound to be some social loafers there, or if not social loafing, at least people who don't understand how the special sauce is made. They have the special sauce in a container and they put it on a burger, but they don't know what goes into it. So if you hire them, particularly in a smaller organization, they can't build a team because they don't know how to actually make the recipe from scratch. They can assemble ingredients once prepared or provided, but they can't go back to the source.
In the old business that I worked for, there was always an experiment to hire someone from big organization A. And we weren't small, we were a couple of thousand people. And the person from bigger organization would come in and they didn't know the ingredients of the sauce. Yeah. They didn't know how to do the whatever it was. And it's not just about adjusting to organizational context.
No,
it's
not at all.
it's the ability and the desire to do work. Again, maybe we're arriving at the point because I feel like I'm naturally attracted to people who think and do, and I see thinking is doing. By the way, building is also doing. Thinking is doing. Building is doing. It's doing something.
Very much.
It's just not administrating. Like waiting for things to come to you and then spreading them around others. It's almost like. I don't even know what you describe that layer as, because I'm not down on leadership. I think they're exceptional. I also notice that some great leaders are hamstrung by the lack of understanding of administrators that they work for, who who carry the title leader.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated space.
And I think this is why it comes back to, I always like to separate leadership from leaders, because you can have a person who is just named the leader. Somebody in an organization needs to be quote unquote the leader, but they don't necessarily engage in leadership. And this is, I guess, where, back to what is my driving passion, helping good people to be better at leadership. It's that, phrase I'm not wild about, but the notion of managing up. How do I work with a person who has been, in a sense, trusted by the board to have that delegated responsibility, but is largely uncertain about how the company works, how processes function, what direction they should take next. But they're very good in, say, a boardroom setting. They exude confidence. They have a way of following you into a revolving door and coming out first. That's kind of their gift in life. So they just shoot up the career ladder. But having got there, they're then very uncertain about what to do next. And I think that paralysis, that fear of looking stupid, but also not knowing where to start with unpacking the ignorance, then comes to see them rely on key people, which is a very good thing if you find the right key people. But unfortunately, I think some of the senior leaders end up picking less than optimal key people who are driving their own agenda, and then this is where organizations start to kilter. But if we get enough people, I guess the junior people, again, to use the phrase I don't particularly like, who can then start to cogently articulate, no, you're not going to change it tomorrow, maybe not even this quarter, but year on year, if enough people in the organization are sort of riffing off, harmonizing, deliberating, discussing, and articulating the same challenges with the same inexorable conclusions, more senior leaders will steadily listen over time. And that's why I always like to say to people, don't become too afraid of the system. Don't think, well, I can never change this corporate beast, so I'm not even going to bother. I'll just either leave the organization or I'll just, wedge into my rut, collect my salary, do the best job I can under the circumstances, and in a sense, silently quit the organization. It's not quite as bad as silent quitting. It's not as though they stop working or they stop being passionate about the work they do, but they're not fully engaged. They're engaged in the KPI, which again is something I'm not all that wild about. They deliver the metric, but then what then baffles the CEO and the board is all of the KPI boxes are being ticked, the metrics are looking amazing, but the org isn't doing that well. And it's because people throughout the organization have stopped thinking about the problem, and instead they're just focusing on deliver. Here's what you need to deliver, great, I'll deliver it. And this is when organizations shift from this more founder, startup, small business mindset of solving for problems and building something new to how do we keep the momentum of the business going forward, because its sheer size means the doors will remain open. We've just got to try to maintain that market share, maybe grow it a little. It'll just become process.
I think there's a cynical side to me.
Nice. I always love this point of a conversation.
I was reflecting this morning about this organization. So it's not about us, but
No.
But for a real conversation this morning. It's like we started in some valley and we've made it to some base camp, the organism, the culture, the company, sorry. And not all the people who started in the valley have made it to base camp, and not all the people who are at base camp are going to make and climb the peak. But the organization will continue. And by the way, that means with or without me too. Because it does take on a life of its own. And, I think I'm fascinated by the next 10 years and what's going to happen to make sure the organization's set to continue on despite the inevitable silent quitting, not fully engaged, self-serving agendas, all of the nonsense that comes with every company, because I feel that you can't get to a certain stage without it. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
And you know, subconscious or conscious sabotage of one's colleagues, you know, whilst you're going from the valley to base camp and base camp up because it serves one's ego, is just, it's inevitable. And it's an interesting crossroads between, you know, your work in, you know, your PhD in leadership and also your wife's work in psychology. I find it a fascinating nexus because, you know, part of this is you know what they say is the pain is the distance between what you wish and your reality. And the pain that I feel in leadership is what I wish for to be true, that it wasn't true.
Yeah.
I wish that those things weren't my reality. And even as a less than 30 person organization, I still see it. I still feel it, you know, not with my current employees, if they're listening, they're all amazing, of course. But, you know, I've had moments along the way. And I look into lots of organizations, hundreds.
And you will, because it is the inevitability of the human condition. I'm delighted that my wife and I have a little one. She's 3 months old. And while she's an endless wellspring of love, joy, and delight, she is relentless looking after her, and it is physically exhausting. And some days I wake up and I'm still as in love with my wife as I ever was. I'm still love my daughter as much as I did the moment I first held her in my arms, which always makes me a little bit teary. I'm as passionate about the things in life I'm passionate about, but there's a certain, I guess I would call it glassiness of eye. I'm just shattered on that given day. And if I'm interacting with someone, they don't quite get the zing, the bounce, the something. And coming back to sort of fears, it was one of my fears coming on the podcast today is, will I have that zing, that bounce? When I open my mouth, will something vaguely articulate wander out? And that's where I think there's that constant, the imperfection of humanity. And I think the trick with leadership is to try and see that in people, to give them a little bit of space, because no one can be on all of the time. No one has a good day every day. But understanding when is an employee, the bounce has just gone out of their bungee, it's all right, it's been a long week, they'll have a weekend and bounce back, versus actually no, the bungee's fundamentally losing its elasticity and this employee isn't going to bounce back from that. And that is where the really difficult conversations happen, because sometimes employees stay with an organization because they're terrified of leaving. They look out at the market and they go, my God, everyone is applying for a job at the moment. How am I going to get through those 1,400 resumes? So it's easier to stay. But they're no longer passionate about the mission. They're often not even passionate about their job. They just don't know how to change. And I think some of the best leadership work that I've done in my career as a manager has actually been to help employees either change roles within an organization or leave an organization, because I think that helps to sort of keep rekindling that fire. And so that's where there will always be an inevitable turnover in an organization, but I think as a society we've gone a little bit too far. There's a presumption that people will burn out, and so we just let them go. And there's also a tendency to not give people enough opportunities to develop within the organization, so they feel the only opportunity to step up is to step out. And it is that fine line. How do you keep employees engaged with an organization over a long period of time without them getting jaded? And that I think only can ever happen at an interpersonal level.
Yeah, it's a real conundrum. Again, I like the word conundrum today. You know, you raised the example of your daughter, and that's right. You know, my eldest is 12. I've invested 12 years into hoping to set her on the right path, and you know, a lot of the, you know, there's her nature, and then the nurture that will set her up. But she's still gonna, and she might fail, and you know, just making it about our family. It's the same for business. I mean, I really like that my daughter and my son will endure, and you know, my stepkids, that they will endure too. Like all four of them. It's just thinking about that, and it's the same for the business. You know, I hope it endures. I hope the DNA is there. my cynicism isn't about this and whether it's possible, like to raise good families, to raise good businesses, because it is a raise.
Yeah.
It's that at some point we start compromising on, helping people step up, on helping them in their career. We forget about psychological safety and compassion for other people's circumstance. It becomes about the organization. So then you compromise. And then compromise on the people you put into positions of power, and they're compromised from the get-go. And it's that cynicism. And this is the reason that actually I enjoyed meeting you, and I do these podcasts, is because I think those gentle corrections for me keep me on path to that. That's actually part of what this is.
Yeah, and that is essential, in a sense, waking up each morning with ultimate appropriate doubt. Not so much questioning your ability, not doubting yourself in the sense of, can I get this done, crisis of confidence, oh God, I'm going to have to fake it till I make it. No, but the doubt in the sense of, let's keep re-challenging some of our principles. You can't do it inexhaustibly. I have to make certain assumptions simply for efficiency in my day. I have to presume that when I get to the bus stop, there will be a bus. I have to presume my car will start. I can't do a full engine check and tires every single time I go to get in a vehicle. It would dramatically slow life down. But coming back to that sense of doubt, it then helps us in this sort of growth. And why I love the term, in a sense, growing an organization, because that's where we sort of see the difference between planning and gardening. Management is very much about that planning process. It's either got a policy or a procedure. There's an established practice out in the community. There's sort of something you can follow. Whereas gardening there's a little bit of a plan to it. You might lay out your bed, decide to plant certain flowers or vegetables with others because you've heard that there's good synergies between them. But it really is, in a sense, how do I create the environment in which things can germinate? And that's where I think, when it comes to helping employees to not burn out, it's about creating those germination conditions. And it's very different for everybody. For some people, it is literally pure cash. But for a lot of people, it's not. And this is where the for purpose, whether they're legally registered as a not-for-profit or not, kind of doesn't matter. But is an organization actually for a purpose that employees are truly aligned with? Or are you a manager or leader in an organization that is constantly in alignment meetings? And I always think, if you're having frequent alignment meetings to try and get everyone back on the same page, and you're constantly having to do this, there's a fundamental problem, because you've got a plan, no one's following it, but you're not creating the necessary conditions for germination to happen. And I think sort of some of the ways that we do that comes back to what we looked at a little bit at the start of the podcast, was this notion of a shared language. Sit down as a team, and it might sound a little bit naff to some people, but sit and talk about how you're using language and how you understand key concepts for the organization. Other things are the use of boundary objects. So think about things like artifacts. And this is particularly important because most teams, most organizations, they tend to be quite cross-functional. It's very rare that we sit in a silo of other people who do the exact same job as us. Generally, particularly in smaller organizations, are often the only person that does that, or maybe one of two. And then we're then interacting with people who are fundamentally cross-functional. So it's about, how do we then get our artifacts to have language that speaks to each other? So when I share my artifact with you, we've got now a genuinely shared understanding, rather than simply a document that's been passed from one person to another. And that's why whenever I see on a phone or on a computer the share button, I always think it's slightly oxymoronic in some senses. It's sending something versus actually sharing the content, sharing the understanding, sharing the purpose or the intent which sits behind it. And finally, I think there's this notion of rituals of reflection. I've sort of mentioned, I think, the Scrum process a few times, and I do like the notion of, at the end of a particular build phase, you'll have a retrospective where the team sits down and the typical, what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we change for next time? And again, weaving these rituals, these spaces into an organization for people to stop doing and start thinking a little bit more, I think is essential. Because the pace of work has only increased, and I think COVID has made it now normal to get your emails and messages in the evening and on weekends. And there's now such a rush for output, such a rush to respond to everything, that we're not taking the time to talk to a colleague before we respond to an email. Instead, we want to dash out a response, and then we'll deal with the fallout later. So again, finding those shared rituals and trying to make it more of that gardening experience.
Yeah. it's a challenge that you know, and I'm not alone. I'm not Robinson Crusoe in this. I think my organisation has too many alignment meetings. You know, and there's a lot of stuff before that you've said, but I think we do. And you said, well, if you have, it might point to a problem, and you need shared language, artifact sharing and understanding, and then rituals of reflection, which I really like, and I will reflect on that. And maybe these are my rituals of reflection. You know, I deal with some of the brightest people. I even think of you and people like you that I meet deal with some of the brightest people. And if I go back to my experience no, I'll make about now. The brightest people, even if in the same field, don't agree.
Yeah.
And, you know, they overtly or subversively derail other experts. You could be in the same organization. You can even be in the same field.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I find that fascinating. And it's a deep conundrum for me that I am not an expert. And yet I find myself, and it's one of, you know, the quadrant that has a discomfort, beyond comfort zone. I'm spending so much time there trying to create shared language that people agree to, artifacts that demonstrate and get agreement to, and then reflecting on, is this what you meant? And I'm at that point, if I link it all the way back to custodian, stewardship, you know, gelling people together, it's like, it's tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's tough. This is what it is. I've listened for 4 years. This is where we are.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're a small business. So we would be a bit like a small team within a... actually, I keep getting corrected by friends of mine. I'm not a small business anymore. We're a medium business. And we're bigger than most. And they keep telling me to stop saying it because I keep talking us down. So it's another reflection. They're like, stop talking yourself down, Chris. You're a bigger business than you think.
And this is the key to language. You know, we keep talking about small businesses, junior employees. You know, it's always this negation. I think this comes back a little bit to experts agreeing or disagreeing. To some extent, experts will disagree because their mindset is just combative. It's simply the way they are. They're frankly, at heart, disagreeable people who like to disagree.
I like disagreeable people. That's probably part of the problem.
Well, again, if you hire a lot of them, then this is going to probably part of the more planning aspect of what does your team composition look like. There's a wonderful program on I think the 6 types of working genius, and you can do a wonderful map of your team to go, if everybody in your team is sitting in the wonder section, and you're kind of really light on all of the 5 other types of geniuses, then you will inevitably end up with a dysfunctional team of utterly amazing people, and you want to try and get that more balance. But also coming back to it, I think there is a societal problem and an interpersonal problem. The societal problem is that we've increasingly started to see true emotions as being negative. So if a person, particularly if they endure a tragedy, but they endure it stoically, people will go, oh, they're not telling you the truth about how they feel. But if the person loses it and screams and shouts and just gets physically very angry, people go, that's an honest emotion. But the honesty of an emotion is how authentic it is. And if a person's authentic reaction to tragedy is calm stoicism, then you've got a genuine reaction and you should love that and celebrate that. And I think that because of that, people have started to work that over into their professional life, which is to say, I need to be a little bit argumentative. I need to be on the front foot. If you present me with a paper, I can't just have good things to say about it. I've got to find the problem. And so many colleagues I've worked with over the years, and I think it gets a little bit worse the better educated and the better a reputation you have for being a thinker, you now almost become a target. If I can take that person down a peg or two, show they don't know as much as people think they know, it's not about trying to destroy or undermine you. It's about trying to build them up. And this comes from the societal to the interpersonal. What is their self-esteem like? And you see that, I think, and I'm starting to appreciate it really with my daughter now for the first time. When there's a challenge, is it about my self-esteem, my need to impose what I want to happen, or is it actually about my daughter's learning opportunity and her self-esteem? And so when I'm managing a team and attempting to provide leadership to them, I try and prioritize my team's self-esteem. And for that, I need to have relatively good self-esteem myself. I need to not worry about looking ignorant. I need to not worry about sometimes looking a little bit silly. I need to not worry about not always having the answers, because if I do get a reputation as a person of knowledge, as a person of deliberation, as a person who's a deep thinker, it happens over a long time period, not because I happen to know the answer of a couple of questions on a quiz show. And so being able to settle into the who am I, what is my self-esteem, what are my drivers, that helps me to be more constructive when dealing with experts versus having low self-esteem, and therefore the primary need is to get across what I know, to impose my set of beliefs, my set of ideas on the team, and have people follow that. Because the thinking is, well, once they start following that idea, they're then by definition following me. And so again, it's that need, I think, for people to constantly assert themselves. And until we create organizations where there's less need to dominate, less need to assert yourself over other people to become successful, it's very hard to go back to that gardening metaphor, that germinating, that creating psychological safety in a team, because there's unhealthy competition happening.
Yeah. You're prompting this, again, a few thoughts. It's very hard for a leopard to hide its spots, and nor should it.
True.
And it's a debate that I've had with people recently about the roles that we play, and there's a situational application of our intellect or not. I mean, there's a certain way that I'm choosing to spend my time and with people. And I've recently described myself as a bit of a chameleon, and it actually had run into some problems because people are like, oh, does that mean you're being inauthentic?
Yeah.
And the answer is no. It just means I situationally apply, we're talking about this. My kids don't want to hear about that. I'm not going to rock up and start saying, and the people talking about the footy aren't going to want to know this. They're going to want to talk what they want to talk about.
Yeah. And that's why I would agree. It's sort of the chameleon metaphor isn't the best one. It just means, frankly, you're a rich and rounded human being who has more than one interest. Because so often, and in part, this is the problem with work. I mean, go to a barbecue. The default question is, what do you do? And people always respond with, I'm a bank manager, I'm a lawyer. They respond with a job title. But that's actually not even what they do. What do you do within that job title? That might be interesting, but even the title and what you do at your day job isn't, hopefully, all of you. And so we almost, in a sense, manufacture this one dimension. And part of the reason is, I think, to do with the way in which marketing has come to dominate society. It's all about, what's your branding? Don't confuse your brand. Be on message. And so the be on message, it becomes ever more simplified. And I see that with organizations. They're trying to deal with a very complex, very unforeseen set of circumstances. But what they want to have is a very simple, understandable message that they keep everybody aligned to. Stay on that brand. And we often tend to feel that ourselves. And we think, well, gosh, I can't have all of these different interests. I can't like rock music and classical. I can't like Homer and, fast fiction. But actually you can. And in a sense, that's what almost being an artist is about, holding two fundamentally different views and still being able to function, to be able to reconcile apparently contradictory ideas. And I think that's, whenever I'm looking for people I enjoy living with, I won't say working with, but actually living with, who do I want to inhabit my life? Who do I want to build stuff with? It's about people who have a diverse range of interests. And it's one of the things, I think, to touch on a slightly political element, that concerns me about so much of the DEI movement. It's so focused on the external trappings of diversity, yet under the surface it's trying to homogenize everybody. Yeah, we want people that look different. We want a female, a male, we want a person in pants and a dress, we want a person with spiky hair and neat hair. But we'd like you all to be on the one message that the organization has. And that, I think, for so many leaders is that real challenge. How do you get teams that are becoming increasingly diverse? Just think of something as simple as organizing a team lunch. Back in the day, when societies or elements of society was a little bit more homogenized, it was, okay, Australia, 70s, mostly blokes in the office, go find a pub that serves steak or schnitzel and put beers on the table. For now, so many people, they don't want to even be in a place that serves alcohol, let alone drink it themselves. And so just the simple dynamic of organizing a team lunch has become ever more complex. You unpack that now to really complicated things in an organization, and then you start to realize, why that roundedness and how you reconcile differences, how you reconcile opposing views starts to become the centrality. And I think that as a manager and as a leader, the more dimensions you have, the better able you are able to understand why some people need to be able to pray multiple times a day, why some people don't want to believe in a God at all, why some people vote for this party or that party, and how those core beliefs then start to manifest in their work and their approach to the organization's mission.
Yeah, it's a very... I sometimes feel the complexity of those circumstances paralyzes me.
And that's why so many managers and organizations reach for the alignment button. I'm paralyzed by the problem. I've got people with the points of view are too divergent. Okay, let's just have one message and everyone stick to it. And look, I'm paying for your time. I don't really care what you think. Just get on and deliver this. And in some circumstances, that is necessary. To your point, we need to do at times. We can't sit and talk forever. But we also need to create an environment in which we can talk, we can reconcile. Otherwise, we start to, and this is how organizations manufacture toxic leaders, people who, if you sat down with them at a barbecue, are actually quite nice people, but they get a reputation as a toxic leader because they're put in what they consider to be a no-win situation, and then they just go, okay, well, I'll just have to direct. And they start using directives, and they're like, well, I'm being successful because I'm delivering things, and I'll just not worry about the rest and accept high staff turnover.
I'm not even sure directives work. And what I mean is because, there is the co-option of the vulnerability movement is that, and DE&I is that.
Yeah.
There's a whole load of... So paralysis is more than, a situational leadership type scenario. It's broad spectrum.
Oh, exactly.
Now I feel very lucky, and back to my cynicism, I feel very lucky that we're starting now, because we're starting with and this is not the same as starting 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We're lucky to have started in the past 4 years, and also to have arrived at a certain base camp with the people that we have, because it's attracted a certain type.
Yeah, and to your point on directives, you're so right, because you then trip over into malicious compliance. There's a lot of busyness, a lot of stuff gets produced, but the organization is still struggling. Maybe the organization's failing. And it comes back to people's calendars are full. And so I always like to have a little bit of a try and find 50% of your week when you're not in meetings, preferably a little bit more than that, and actually make some time to be able to sit and think, to actually talk to colleagues, but not about necessarily a specific task. It's not as though I've got a task I need to perform. Let's get together and talk about how we're going to deliver that. Sometimes we just need to talk about our roles in the organization more broadly. And that's where I think, the usually ignored job description, which you see on an ad when you apply for something, it then goes in a drawer and no one addresses it. These are the sort of artifacts that in organizations need to be surfaced and need to be given life. Because otherwise, as businesses, for those that use Confluence, the number of pages or the wikis or however you store information is just growing and growing and growing. There's a policy for that, but no one knows what it says and no one actually follows it. Or if they do, they comply maliciously because they've been given a directive. And so it's, how do we start to bring these documents alive, and how do we start to bring language alive? And I think once you do that, you then start to bring people alive in organizations in a much more effective way.
Yeah, understand. You're well read. You have, it's funny, I don't find you academic in the way that you have academic achievement, because people can use that as a slight in a way. Oh, they're so academic. Yeah. So, I'm careful of that distinction.
Oh, I've had that in my career a lot. It's not uncommon to, if I write a report someone doesn't like, it instantly gets labeled an academic study.
Okay. I get labelled a dreamer, so there we go. We talked at the beginning about Socratic style, and you used it in the we're all in perpetual state of ignorance despite our education, which is a very Socratic philosophy, I would suppose. And I really like the idea of asking questions without the answer, which I know is Socratic in style, or without having to answer for the person. When you have spent as much time in equipping yourself, I'm changing the words intentionally, how do you refrain from not chiming in on an area in which you're an expert to make people feel that you're not academizing them? which isn't a word.
Yeah. Well, look, we can coin it. I mean, if you look at Shakespeare, I think he invented about 2,500 words that didn't exist, but people love it in his plays, and now it's high literature. So go figure.
Thank you for equating me to Shakespeare.
Oh, got to put something out there.
That's right.
Good question. I mean, to an extent, I haven't quite solved for it because where I think I occasionally struggle with people is, I think it's that wonderful saying, I didn't have the time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one.
I love that expression.
What I love about truly brilliant people is they can take the most complex issues in the universe, and you particularly see that in the field of physics, and they distill it into something that anybody can understand, whether you have a background in physics or not. It doesn't make a difference. And where I struggle is, I suppose some people consider me well-read. I slightly consider myself marginally illiterate. But again, that's because I think the more that I read, the more I understand, and the more that I realize how much more is out there that I haven't yet understood. And in a sense, for a lot of topics, I haven't thought about them long enough, and I'm not literate enough or well-equipped enough to articulate them succinctly. So I articulate them in a complex way because it's the best I can do in the moment. And while that would be a great start, if I was working with someone who, in a sense, has a it sounds a bit pretentious and I don't mean it that way, but kind of an equal capacity for articulation or an equal erudition, then we actually get quite a good dynamic. But if I don't, and particularly if I'm working as I do with ever more senior people who frankly want a blunt force solution to a problem. They don't want to sit with doubt. They don't want to sit with uncertainty. They want clarity and they want an answer and they want it today. And as some leaders have said to me, I want it in 5 words or less. And as I respond, well, I can't articulate that in 5 words. And then they think, okay, well, you're not my solution person. I'm going to go find somebody else. And that's where I think a lot of good people end up getting left behind in organizations because they've thought about it enough, but not so much that they can give that easily understandable solution. And this is why I think so many people rely on brand and elevator pitches. I was once advised, look, best thing to do, and if you want to succeed in business, think about what you work on, come up with a 20-second elevator pitch, and if you ever end up in an elevator with a CEO and they go, what are you working on? You tell them in 20 seconds, and then that might interest them. I'm more interested in the thing that you can't put in a 20-second pitch that actually piques their interest to go, well, I know enough to know I'm interested, but I want to hear more. But for some people, that's too nuanced and but you're still not on brand. You're missing the point. And part of me has to accept a bit of that because I want to get ahead in the world, but part of me also doesn't want to give into it. I want to keep wrestling with the problems we haven't solved with, and I still want to articulate them in a way that's not completely intelligible, if for no other reason than I don't completely understand them. But I feel that by having the dialogue, we've moved that little bit further forward. And in a sense, I think this comes back to the number one mindset shift that I think leaders need to embrace, which is that real progress often looks like confusion. And that often, particularly when you work in very big organizations with hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on the line, nobody wants confusion. They want certainty. But if we can get people to realize that what on the surface looks like confusion, it doesn't mean that it's failure, so long as, and this is the critical bit, we push below that layer of confusion and then we start to see the expertise that's churning underneath. And that doesn't make it look very elegant on the surface, but is fundamentally solving big problems. And that's where, in a sense, I like to say success is the phoenix that rises from the ashes of doubt. A team who are uncertain about what's going on, it looks like confusion, but once you sit down, have a in-depth, a beyond an elevator pitch conversation with them, you realize that, I think the thing we spoke about the other day, they're stacked individuals. And they have so many layers, and the more you press into the problem with them, the deeper their layers go. And when you've got that, you know that an organization will start to be successful because it has those people working in it versus the brand people who look great on the surface, but you start to push below that. And as we've done today, they can't talk for an hour and a half on their topic. They just run out of steam because they don't really know. They've simply learnt some catchphrases and they've learnt enough of a process to do enough of their job to remain in gainful employment versus someone who wakes up and goes, I don't know how to do this job, Let's see how other people have done it. Let's then challenge that and work out, is this the best way to do it? But I'd also argue that has to happen very quickly. And this is the real challenge for, sorry if I finish off the thought before I lose my own thread. This is often the challenge for leaders in the teams that you put together. Because the brighter the people that you hire, the faster they'll churn through problems to arrive at solutions, but often the more friction you get with working with them. When you get teams that are slightly less frictive, the problem is they take a lot longer to arrive at a solution. And the challenge for management is it's only worth the business's while to spend so long on a problem. And this is where people who produce content come in. They've got very good at producing very good content very quickly because they've become the subject matter experts. So it's about how as an organization do we harness those subject matter experts, get them working in a mode whereby they're producing high quality work very quickly, and then you start to get truly scalable organizations.
You know, actually, I'll go all the way back to the beginning. You talked about the ability to give things in a simple form. That quote, as simple as possible, but no simpler, it comes to mind, because some things can't be done in 5 words.
Oh, absolutely.
They just can't. The second thought it takes me on to is the importance of authentic team dynamic. I give an example. You and I are quite an interesting combo.
We are.
You do the deep work. You think about the problem to great detail. I'm not talking about overthink.
No.
I'm just saying think.
Yeah.
And my job is to tell the story.
And also to create the space. Because so often in life, we don't have the space. We're too busy doing the shopping, changing a nappy. We're too busy rushing out the door to work. We're too busy dashing from meeting to meeting. It's, to have a brief rant about technology, it's one of the things that I loathe about Teams and Zoom meetings. The fact I can leave and join a meeting in the click of a button versus kind of the good old days where I had to get up, probably out of that meeting room, trudge across to another meeting room, maybe go down a couple of levels, and there was that thinking space in between meetings. Yeah. But instead now we're driving that relentless energy. And so what we are really losing is the space for thinking. There was a wonderful essay, I forget the author who wrote it, but he was talking about the demise of smoking. And it was sort of, well, isn't that a good thing? Well, lung cancer statistics-wise, yes. But what he said was, back in the day, I would wander out of the office, sit on a park bench and have a cigarette, and I would think. And it probably took about 20 minutes to half an hour. And the 20-minute mark is that time of how long it takes to really start to get into a deep train of thought. And so we would have more deeper trains of thinking during the day. Without the smoko break, he no longer had that. So in a sense, how organizations can create a slightly healthier smoko break for people to actually have that space.
Coffee.
Exactly, coffee breaks to sit and to think with them. And I think that people that, and this is where true leadership comes in, who can recognize the need for that in their organizations and realize that busy teams aren't effective or efficient teams, creating enough space so that the important doing work gets done, but as does the important thinking work.
Yeah, no, I really do recognize that. I'm an outcomes fiend. I'm very clear about what people have to produce, and their job is either it's black and white, you can have it or you're not. It's up to you. I actually almost don't mind what you do day to day or minute to minute, because there's always a reason something gets in the way, and it's up to you to navigate that over an appropriate period of time. So, but it is an uncomfortable space to sit in as a leader. To say, look, you can be wherever you want, you can do whatever you want. I need you here at these times, but the outcome is the outcome, as opposed to micromanaging exactly where people are. For example, I would like to work from home today. Is that okay? And then to authentically go, yes, that is okay.
Yeah.
I would like to. I need to. Can I have some of? And not because they're demanding, but because they're trying to create the space for whatever it is that they need to do. And I do. I don't. Maybe in the past I had to ignore that instinct to say, no, you have to be here.
Very much.
But it's still a journey to today, this morning, like it happens all the time.
And you're right, it is very hard as a manager or as a leader to provide that space, because there's that great fear, but what if things aren't getting done? And certainly for some managers, what am I even doing here if I'm not overseeing? What actually is my purpose? And that's where I think managers do very well to shift into the leadership space, to understand what is the value that they provide when they're not overseeing tasks. Because to be successful, they have to go beyond that. They have to create the objective and then let the expert get on with working out the best way to deliver it. But what do you do in between those objective check-ins? That's, I guess, the space of leadership, and that's where so many managers just frankly get a little bit frightened and just revert to micromanaging, because it's so much easier if I have a daily check-in with the team and they're telling me what they're doing and I can write it down. And I think a lot of it comes back to the fear of what if something goes wrong. There's the a wonderful film, I think it's Moneyball, where a team's put together, but the coach of the team won't play the team the way the baseball manager had intended. And his answer was, well, look, I'm going to play the team the way I can explain our losses at the end of the season. And I think so often that's what managers do in organizations. They run teams, they deliver projects in ways that they can explain it if it goes wrong. And it's that almost need for an insurance policy, that inability to take appropriate risks in an organization, that sees so many managers default to the micromanaging. So if it goes wrong, I can tell my boss, but look, I checked in with people every single day and here's a list of their deliverables and here are all the elements. And then if it really goes badly wrong, people will go, well, at least they managed it well, even if it was a terrible outcome. But I think once we go down that, you then end up in a highly bureaucratic organization with the wrong approach to risk appetite.
Yeah. We're about approaching time, and there's a few more things we should go through. You make me realize that the summary of the thing that I'm interested in is the philosophy of business and leadership. And I haven't connected that as a thought before. So, that's thanks to you. And I observe that a lot of leaders, and I'm talking of friends of mine, in the organizations that they are in, to their subordinates or their superiors, don't get a chance to have this conversation about the philosophy of business and leadership for whatever reason. And so I'm projecting, but I really want to encourage people into that space, because there are, deep wells of knowledge and reflection and, paths forward that we haven't even thought about. And this morning it came up, and I couldn't think of a better analogy, but I was talking about Eckhart Tolle and a new earth and the blossoming of spirituality. And over time, it seems to more and more people, are embracing it. It's not about religion, but it's something else, right? Anyway, this is a long connection
in a sense about the need for something greater than ourselves.
Perhaps, yeah. And I think that it's a different age. But I think too of leadership. It's not that the individuals are alone. They are alone, but they're not as alone they once are. I notice pockets of blossoming of leadership philosophy happening, because I happen to run into them every other day. And it's really interesting for those people that are interested in that to connect on it to further, because you mentioned about organizations keeling before because there isn't enough momentum around this philosophy, whereas if those people can get together and talk about it, I think there's potential for cross-pollination, new knowledge, new action.
Tremendously so. And this is where dialogue is so important to really, and it's, I guess, one of the benefits of aspects of social media. And I always say aspects of, because it also can very easily become an echo chamber, which is problematic. But to free up the way in which people can connect over distance means that you no longer, in a sense, need to be sitting in the Athenaeum to be able to have a conversation with like-minded people. You can be sitting in different cities in different countries, and you can still engage in that conversation. I think that's the wonder, the great promise of technology that so often gets sidelined because of the silos that the algorithms create. Which is why I always try and encourage people to try and move beyond the algorithm, to try and actually seek out that which you don't agree with, and try and actually endlessly doubt and endlessly stress test the things that you're working on from an organizational philosophy point of view. Because otherwise, again, this need to deliver, this need to dispel all doubt, this need to look like a safe pair of hands means that people are unwilling to question. And the reality is, if you do that for long enough, you fundamentally will lose the capacity to think critically, because it is a perishable skill.
Hell yes.
And it is, if I can have a brief rant about academia, the thing that I'm so loathing about the modern university education. The purpose of a university degree used to not be to create a trades person. I don't mean that in a negative way about trades. It's more just, it's not a technical problem that a university should be trying to solve. It's about trying to teach people how to think about problems. And so historically, probably going back more 50, 60, 100 years, the benefit of hiring someone that had a university degree was, I've got someone that probably will have learned how to think critically. Unfortunately, now we're so focused on what are the hard skills that I can then put on the dot points of a resume. People want to come out with AI, cybersecurity, people and culture. And they want like some sort of a skill set that they can label and put on a CV, as opposed to, and this is what used to undermine me at the start of my career, people said, well, what did you get out of your university degree? How is that beneficial to us? Well, it taught me how to think and taught me how to think better. And so many people didn't know what to do with that. So they would pass over and go, well, I want someone who's doing more than thinking. Okay. But that is the reality of it. And unfortunately, as people become so trapped in the delivery mechanism, they spend 20 years climbing the greasy pole, become the most senior people with positional authority, and don't realize they've spent 25 years not critically thinking. And now when literally it makes or breaks their job, that capacity is lost. So they then double down on the delivery approach.
Yeah, I'm so with you. Not that I spent as much time in academia as you, or at all, in fact. I think it was mostly the student union honing those chameleon skills that people say I shouldn't talk about. Yeah, more time should be spent on long form like this.
Yeah, agreed.
I just wanted to, not that you need to hear it, but I really enjoyed the recent article that you wrote, and not because it was prompted by a conversation we had. I observe to people who write content, not you, others, that their content is homogenized, and there's certain trigger phrases in there that aren't objective, they're subjectively created, and they're losing their ability to create. And you had some absolute ripper one-liners in your thing, and I mean this. I thought, oh, that's a beautiful articulation of that concept. Not like okay, not I thought, oh my god, those are words. And so I really encourage you to not need it, but I enjoy it. So if you're only writing for me and I'm your audience, then so be it. But because we're losing that art.
Yeah.
And I think it's a classic. People say to me, there's a tension point, Chris. You're a dreamer, and then somebody else would say you're an overthinker. And dreaming and thinking and doing aren't necessarily different because it's I've thought about, I have a vision for the way this should work. Let me think about it. Let me do something about it to test it.
Yeah.
And I do worry, and it's still a conundrum. I can't say that word in my head. It's like, how do you truly take advantage of the brightest people in the business and have them sometimes filter the way they articulate that intellect? I mean, I know some incredibly bright people, and they just can't shift gear. They can't adapt to their environment. They just can't help but shine bright.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
And it's not just the content, it's just the tone of voice and the like all of it.
Absolutely.
So I look forward to reading more of your stuff now. So just with that in mind, where can people find your work, and where should they look you up?
Yeah, absolutely. So people can certainly go to my website where I write a weekly column, robert.winter.inc, and that'll take you straight to it. You can find all my content on there. I also post the links to the articles on LinkedIn and on Twitter. So again, feel free to hit me up there or follow me. I love a dialogue, love an exchange. And if you're nervous about sharing your views publicly, I'm also happy for private exchanges. And I'd probably say that would be my number one guidance to people, is to do a little bit more writing. You don't have to go on a podcast to have discussions. You don't have to write articles to write. You can write articles just to think for your own personal record. And that's how a lot of my writing started. I mean, I post it simply in the hope that someone might get some form of benefit out of it. But a lot of it's how I think. And it's why I love to write things down, because I find when I sit with the words for a little bit, in the written form, unlike a verbal conversation down the pub, I get to constantly realign, relook at the words. Sometimes I'll have a word, and I found that actually over the last few months, I've been thinking about complication and complexity, and I realize I've habitually just started using the word complex a lot. Even when I don't mean complex, I mean complicated. And it's those nuances that unfortunately some people dismiss as, literary wankery or some kind of academic nonsense, and who really cares about it. But once we start, in a sense, stripping that meaning away from language, then all you've got actually is sound that's being exchanged. And then instead of words becoming these miraculous things that, as I think to quote Edmund Burke, catches a fire in another person's chest, it kind of kindles that passion, that enthusiasm, they become really dead things. They kind of land like a tennis ball on a peat bog. It doesn't bounce, it does nothing for anybody. And sadly, in an attempt to homogenize organizations to achieve a particular goal, there's been that homogenization of words, which again needs to be separated from a shared language, because we can discuss ideas. And coming to academic papers, one of the first things you're always prompted to do is define the words that you're using, define how you're intending them to be understood and received. We can then argue about the definition, but at least we've thought about the words. And so I really encourage everybody to think about the words you use in everyday life, even if it's just, a text message response or a Teams chat. Try and actually pause and think about the words that you're using and how you use them, and use them with intention. And I think that as you start to do that, it will create a bit of a wellspring in the organization, that even if you have managers who want 5 words or less, don't actually want to engage with it, you'll actually create a network of people within the organization, because there are a lot of really wonderful, talented, brilliant people out there that you just never hear from. But once you start to open yourself up, and it's the thing I guess I'm fairly fortunate that I don't mind standing out. I don't mind looking different. I don't mind, in a sense, senior leaders, term again I really loathe, looking at me with, he's a bit of an academic guy, but whatever, just ignore him. I'm not really bothered by that too much, because I find it creates a wonderful network of people within the organization who, as so often whenever we've had workshops or company-wide meetings, I'm so glad you stood up and said that. I'm so glad you had the courage to do that. And so really, if we all just apply a small amount of courage, even if it's just reaching out to a colleague privately and expressing your views with them and having that shared conversation, we can, to your point, find more like-minded people. And I think in doing so, we do create a better world.
Triggered by what you said, read to broaden the mind, write to sharpen it. Is the expression. I realise that read to broaden the mind, talk to people to broaden the mind, and write to sharpen it is a real thing.
It is.
You've referenced a couple of timeless principles, like understanding some of the classics, some of the principles around philosophy, and also some of these things that I it's tiring to see how rapidly they're disappearing, and how rapidly not even an opinion, but an alternate view could be derided. I
mean, this was in a sense to go back to that off-quote in book 1984 in Newspeak. The notion is, once we start removing language of difference, once we start removing language of opposition, once we start removing language that allows us to express an idea, that's how you do create that ultimate totalitarian state. And while that's obviously quite an extreme example, we often do that kind of in microcosms in our own way. We deny ourselves the ability to think dangerous ideas because we don't open ourselves up to the language needed to express them.
Yeah. It's a whole other podcast. You were making me think about Orwellian language and doublethink earlier on, when you mentioned about the ability to hold two thoughts in tension, whereas that's doublethink has the ability to know the truth but believe the lie.
Yeah.
So I that's a whole other podcast. I have an idea for the 20-second lift conversation for you, which I'll share off air.
Yeah.
But it's next time a CEO asks you what you do, I have an answer, because this hour and 45 has given me some insights I'd love to share, but separately. So thank you very much, Rob, for your time. Very grateful. I really enjoyed our little adventure there, and look forward to next time already.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute delight.